In 2004, researcher at the University of California, Irvine named Gloria Marks sat quietly inside a series of open-plan offices and did something almost no one had done before. She watched people work, not their output, not their productivity scores. She watched the moment-to-moment reality of a human being trying to hold a single thought. What she measured, with a stopwatch, across 2.5 months of observation, was how long the average office worker spent on any one task before switching to something else. The answer was 2 minutes and 35 seconds. She published the finding in the Proceedings of the ACM SIGCHI Conference on Human Factors in Computing Systems, and it barely registered. I found it while looking for something else entirely, a citation in a footnote about workplace ergonomics in the 1980s, and I almost kept scrolling. That detail lodged in me like a splinter. 2 minutes and 35 seconds in 2004. I wrote it down and moved on. But then I kept finding the number. Or rather, I kept finding versions of the number. Each one slightly smaller. Each one attached to a different decade, a different institution, a different researcher who seemed equally puzzled by what they were measuring. And at some point I stopped looking for the ergonomics footnote entirely. This is the story of how I fell into that particular hole. The clearest place to begin is not 2004, but 1978. That is the year Herbert Simon, economist, cognitive scientist, and future Nobel laureate, gave a lecture at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in which he used a phrase he had been circling for nearly a decade. He called it the poverty of attention. His argument was precise and uncomfortable. A world rich in information necessarily creates a world poor in the thing required to process it. Attention, he said, is a finite resource. It can be depleted. It can be engineered. And once you understand it as a resource, certain questions follow naturally. Questions about who benefits from its depletion and who loses. Simon did not pursue those questions at length that evening. He was a scientist, not a polemicist. But the phrase sat in the literature quietly, like a match someone had left on a shelf. What does it mean for attention to be a resource? The behavioral science answer arrives in stages. In September of 1948, B.F. Skinner, then a professor at Indiana University, published a study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology titled Superstition in the Pigeon. It is usually cited in discussions of conditioning, of reward and behavior, but what Skinner had actually demonstrated, with his variable ratio reinforcement schedules, was something more elemental. That unpredictable reward produces compulsive engagement. The pigeon does not stop because it cannot know when the pellet is coming. The interval does not matter. The uncertainty is the mechanism. Skinner noted this without alarm. It was a finding about birds. It was a finding about birds in 1948, and it would remain unremarked upon for the better part of 3 decades. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. But here's where it gets strange. In October of 1983, the Federal Communications Commission, under Chairman Mark Fowler, formally eliminated the guidelines restricting advertising time during children's television programming. The guidelines had kept commercial content at 9.5 minutes per hour on weekends and 12 minutes per hour on weekdays. Their removal was framed as a deregulatory measure, an act of market liberation. What it did in practice was transform children's television into what critics inside the FCC called, in an internal memo that would surface years later, a direct commercial environment. By 1985, the average American child was watching roughly 4 hours of television per day, according to figures collected by the Nielsen Company, and the programming surrounding them had been architecturally redesigned, scene lengths shortened, edit rates accelerated. The cut, the hard visual interruption, became the primary tool of children's media, not the exception. It was, a producer at one of the major broadcast networks said in a 1987 interview with Broadcasting Magazine, simply, what held attention? It was what the numbers demanded. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The edit rate in children's programming in 1970 averaged approximately 1 cut per 5 to 7 seconds. By 1991, according to content analyses conducted by Daphna Lemish of Tel Aviv University and published in the journal Communication Research, that interval had compressed to under 2 seconds in segments designed to attract and retain young viewers. Not 2 minutes, 2 seconds. Lemish was not alarmed in the way a polemicist would be alarmed. She was simply noting what she saw. She was noting that the architecture of children's media had been redesigned around a particular theory of engagement, and that the theory was working, insofar as viewership numbers were concerned. What was it costing on the other side of the ledger? Return now to Gloria Mark. In 2023, 19 years after her initial 2004 study, she published a follow-up. The 2 minutes and 35 seconds she had measured in 2004 had become, by 2012, 75 seconds. By 2020, it had reached 47 seconds. She published these figures in her book Attention Span, released in January of 2023 by Hanover Square Press, and she was careful throughout to present the data as correlational, not causal. She did not claim to know exactly what had compressed the interval. She was a scientist. She offered the number and stood back from it. 47 seconds. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Meanwhile, in the summer of 2016, Tristan Harris, a former design ethicist at Google, circulated a presentation internally at the company titled, "A Call to Minimize Distraction and Respect Users' Attention." Harris had studied under B.J. Fogg at Stanford's Persuasive Technology Lab, an institution that had been, since its founding in 1998, devoted to the systematic study of how digital interfaces change human behavior. Harris's presentation argued that the engineering choices embedded in smartphone design, the pull-to-refresh gesture, the notification badge, the infinite scroll, were direct applications of the variable ratio reinforcement schedule Skinner had identified in September of 1948 with his pigeons. The presentation was passed around the company. Some people found it interesting. Nothing changed. Harris left Google in 2016 and began speaking publicly. The presentation became a footnote in a documentary. The documentary was watched by many millions of people who then returned to their phones. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a reasonable explanation for all of this, and I want to give it its full weight. Media ecosystems change because audiences change because technology changes. The telegraph accelerated information long before the smartphone. Newspapers trained readers to skim. Radio interrupted silence. Each generation has believed the new medium was rotting something essential, and each generation has largely adapted. The Roman philosopher Seneca complained, in a letter written sometime around 62 AD, about the difficulty of concentrating in a city full of noise. He was not describing a neurological crisis. He was describing life. Maybe I am seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe Gloria Mark's declining numbers reflect not a degradation, but an adaptation. A species learning to navigate a denser informational environment by moving through it faster, sampling more, committing less. Cognitive flexibility, not cognitive collapse. The simplest explanation is often correct. And yet, the 47 seconds sits there. Herbert Simon's poverty of attention sits there. The FCC's 1983 decision sits there. Skinner's pigeons sit there in their boxes, waiting for the unpredictable pellet with the focused, compulsive attention that has no off switch. I cannot prove a line of causation through these points. I am not a neuroscientist or a policy historian or a media theorist. I am someone who found a footnote and followed it further than I intended. What I notice is that the researchers who studied this question earliest, Simon in Pittsburgh, Mark in Irvine, Lemish in Tel Aviv, were not alarmed in the conspiratorial sense. They were troubled in the way that careful observers are troubled when measurement reveals something that doesn't fit the expected shape of the world. They published their numbers. They stood back. They waited for someone to ask the next question. There's a book in the British Library, in the Humanities Reading Room on the 3rd floor, that I keep thinking about. It is a 1927 edition of Walter Dill Scott's Influencing Men in Business, a text in industrial psychology that was, when it was published, considered a serious scientific contribution to the question of how to direct human attention toward commercial ends. Scott was a psychologist and later the president of Northwestern University. He was not a villain. He was simply the first to systematically treat attention as something that could be aimed, a beam, a resource, a raw material for commerce. The book is unremarkable. It is worn at the spine. Someone has underlined a passage on page 43 in pencil, the handwriting old enough that I could not identify it, a sentence about the plastic nature of the attending mind. Whoever read that page was curious, not sinister. They just wanted to understand how it worked. That book sits in a reading room in London. Its penciled annotation still visible after almost 100 years. The person who underlined that sentence is gone. The question they were asking is not, when we talk about shortening attention spans, we're usually talking about technology, or dopamine, or a generation of young people who cannot read long paragraphs. But what if the more honest question is older than all of that? What if it is the question that penciled annotation was already asking in 1927, and the question is simply this: once you have learned to direct attention, who decides where it goes?